Welcome to the BMES Professional Development Webinar, Connecting Leaders in BME with Underrepresented Groups. I'm Jessie Lynn Dunn, and I'll be your moderator today. I'm a postdoctoral fellow in the Snyder Lab in the Department of Genetics and the Mobilize Center at Stanford University, and I also serve as a member of the BME Ethics Subcommittee. Before we begin, there are a few housekeeping items. First, this webinar is being recorded for your convenience. The slides and archived recording will be available in the next several days through the BMES website on the e-learning page. Next, at any time during this webinar, you may submit questions by using the online chat function in the lower left of your screen. Please submit your questions as we go. Your questions will be addressed by the speaker at the end of the webinar. Last, please do not exit the webinar right at the end because there will be a brief evaluation. We would greatly appreciate your feedback, so please take a moment to complete it. To get us started, we have a few polling questions. To answer the polling question, select your answer and click Submit directly on your computer screen. Please take about 30 to 40 seconds to answer each question before I read them aloud. So to give us a sense of who's joining us today on this webinar, please let us know which of the following best describes you. We'll give it a few moments. Okay, so it looks like we have main representation with graduate students, but representation from other groups including undergrads, postdoctoral fellows, pre- and post-tenure faculty. So it's great to see such a variety of people on the webinar today. Next, we'd like to get a better idea of the ethnic breakdown of the group. So please go ahead and answer this poll. We'll just give it a few more seconds here. All right, so again, it looks like we have representation across different ethnic groups. So it's great to see that we have a variety of people here on the webinar today. Finally, we have one more question about, we have two more questions. We wanted to get a better understanding of the gender breakdown of individuals on the webinar today, so please feel free to answer this question. All right, so it looks like we have representation from both male and female members, so that's great to see. It's great to see support from both sides. And then finally, for our last question, we will be looking at career paths that are being considered. So for those who are still in the graduate, undergraduate, even postdoctoral or pre-tenure phase, please feel free to fill in what your projected career path would be. All right, we still have some responses coming in, so I'll give it a few more seconds. Okay, so it looks like the majority of people in the webinar today are interested in academic research, but we also have some people who have dual interests in industry, entrepreneurship, and maybe some other fields related to research and biomedical engineering. So we'll be looking forward to hearing from Dr. Tejal Desai to touch upon her experiences in these realms. So now I'd like to introduce our featured speaker, Dr. Tejal Desai. Dr. Desai is currently the Ernest L. Prien Professor and Chair of the Department of Bioengineering and Therapeutic Sciences at the University of California, San Francisco. She is also a member of the California Institute for Quantitative Biomedical Research, PI of the UCSF UC Berkeley Graduate Group in Bioengineering Training Grants, and founding director of the UCSF UC Berkeley Masters in Translational Medicine. She received her Bachelor of Science degree in Biomedical Engineering from Brown University in 1994, and her PhD in Bioengineering from the Joint Graduate Program at the University of California, Berkeley, and the University of California, San Francisco in 1998. Dr. Desai currently directs the Laboratory of Therapeutic Micro and Nanotechnology, where her research focuses on using micro and nanofabrication techniques to develop devices for cell and drug delivery scaffolds, for cell and tissue regeneration, and functional biomaterials. In addition to authoring over 200 technical papers and delivering over 200 invited talks, she has chaired and organized numerous conferences and symposia in the area of biomemes, micro and nanofabricated biomaterials, and micro-nanoscale drug delivery tissue engineering. Her other interests include K-12 educational outreach, gender and science in education, science policy issues, and biotechnology and bioengineering industrial outreach. Her research efforts have earned recognition including Technology Review's Top 100 Young Innovators, Popular Science's Brilliant 10, and NSF's New Century Scholar. Some of her other honors include the Uran Grand Prize Award for Innovative Drug Delivery Technology, the Young Career Award from the Engineering in Medicine and Biology Society, or IEEE EMBS, the Dawson Biotechnology Award, and the UC Berkeley and Brown University Distinguished Engineering Alumni Awards. In 2015, she was elected to the National Academy of Medicine. The floor is yours, Dr. Desai.
Great. Thank you so much, Jessalyn, for that really kind introduction, and thank you to all of you who took the time to be here on this webinar. I wanted to tell you really about sort of my voyage to where I am today, and think about this really in the context of both the opportunities that were in my path as well as some of the challenges. And, you know, it's really been a passion of mine to figure out how I can not only be a good scientist and engineer, but also figure out ways that we can broaden participation within the sciences and engineering. So I'll hopefully tell you a little bit about my background. This is not going to be a research seminar, so not a lot of data slides, but I'm happy to talk about anything that the audience wants answers to after I go through this. So let me just start out. In the introduction, you sort of saw a little bit, heard a little bit about, you know, where I was educated and sort of where I am right now. But it's been an interesting pathway. Sort of crisscrossed the country and been in a lot of institutions and different environments. And I think those have really shaped how I think about science and how I think about the notion of building community. I think along the way sort of had academic milestones that were really meaningful to me, as well as personal milestones. And, you know, I think it's important to recognize that, you know, there are these many stages in one's careers, and, you know, trying to figure out what is right at any given time for oneself. So I'll start at the beginning because I think it, again, sort of shapes how I think about my role in academia and bioengineering. I actually grew up in Southern California, in Santa Barbara, which, you know, is such an idyllic place. But interestingly enough, as an Asian American, it was an environment that was not very welcoming. I was a part of an immigrant family, so my parents, my father, mother came over to go to graduate school. My father was a chemical engineer, actually at Michigan, and then they moved over to Southern California. And so I grew up in a community that was largely homogeneous, but it also had, you know, quite a large Latino population as well. But there were very few Asian American kids. I was, in fact, one of 3 Asians, one Indian in my high school of over 2,000. So it was sort of an interesting environment, and I think at that time sort of tried to really fit into that environment. My parents were very much interested in me becoming, sort of as sort of integrated into that environment as possible. I actually, for those reasons, I never actually learned my native tongue. My parents did not want me to have an accent. They were very much, do everything the American way. And that, I think I didn't know any better, if you will. And so I sort of was always trying to fit in, but never quite sort of fitting in that time between sort of, I guess, elementary school all the way to high school. And, it was in that time, of course, that my interest for science and engineering started to emerge. And I actually became interested in the field of biomedical engineering actually in high school. And it was because of a program that I got involved with that was sponsored by the National Science Foundation that basically took girls who were interested in engineering and offered them sort of a 4-week experience in New York City where you get to meet women engineers and, spend time learning about the different engineering disciplines. So as a junior in high school, I was already pretty convinced that, one, I wanted to be an engineer, but more importantly, I had met this really cool person who was developing orthopedic implants called a biomedical engineer, and I was convinced that that was the type of engineering I wanted to do. So, very, very early experience now, really sort of defined the rest of my career. And I think that's also why I think it's so important to mentor students at that level. So I ended up sort of at that point looking for programs that offered biomedical engineering, and this is in the sort of late 1980s, early 1990. Actually, there weren't a lot of programs back then. There were some historically great programs in engineering that were just starting to create undergraduate biomedical engineering degrees. But I stumbled upon a program at Brown University, which is where I then headed. And this was important because not only was I interested in engineering, I also sort of had this sort of interest in social issues. And all through the sort of process of me trying to integrate into living in sort of Southern California, I always felt like, why is there this sort of racial divide between the populations that were in Santa Barbara? And, why were there major inequalities between these groups through our educational system? And so I actually went to Brown with sort of dual interests, both in sort of biomedical engineering as well as in sociology and political science. It's interesting because I became very involved on sort of the activism front. I actually, as a freshman, became involved in a group which authored this 100-page report that looked at diversity at the faculty ranks and at the student level at the university and across all disciplines, and ended up advocating to the administration about diversifying the faculty. And I spent so much time on that my freshman year that I actually was not doing well in my engineering classes. And I think one of the experiences that stand out in that time frame was the fact that my undergrad engineering advisor actually told me that I should drop out of engineering. And that I would be better suited for sort of a softer discipline and something that, may be better suited for a woman. And that, again, was at a university that, prides itself on being, inclusive and forward-thinking, yet here I was as an undergraduate student being told by my engineering advisor that I wasn't good enough. And I spent a lot of time that first year really sort of trying to figure out where I would go with this. I was always the sort of the person in high school who did well in these fields, and suddenly, oh my gosh, what was I going to do? But on the other hand, I at the same time had met a woman who was in the medical school at Brown who ended up allowing me to start doing undergraduate research. And in this very early time within my academic career, sort of freshman year, I began to get involved in polymer science and drug delivery. And while I was sort of shaken in terms of confidence in the classroom, I was really sort of mentored and encouraged in the laboratory domain. And I started to really grow as a scientist. And I finally said, I'm going to do this. I'm going to actually, be a successful engineer, scientist, and also, figure out a way where I can balance my interests in, all of the social issues that I was passionate about. But it was hard. I was sort of, I felt like I was leading a dual life in some regards because there weren't a lot of engineers who had any interest in issues on campus that I was interested in. And so, that sort of circle that I interacted was very disparate from the other circle of peers and friends that I made. But through that experience, I think what I realized is that, again, there's going to be sort of people who doubt your abilities, and it's important to find the right mentors that will encourage you and sort of get you on the right track. My undergraduate research advisor, really told me that, I need to focus on this set of sort of academic challenges in order to really be able to make an impact and be a role model in the future. And, I think just her sort of being there to be a sounding board actually allowed me to then thrive in the classes that, supposedly I wasn't, good enough to be able to complete. So I ended up sort of turning around that freshman year and, being very, very involved both in the engineering side of things, but also still managing to try to keep my interest in diversity and inclusion. I worked as a minority peer counselor. I was on student council. And then through that time, I also realized that there is an intersection between science and issues of inclusion. And, there are ways in which we can try to make science more inclusive. And I think that's sort of been a theme that I've been interested in ever since those days. From that, I ended up doing a lot of work in with Edith Mathiowicz at Brown, and she actually was a student of Bob Langer. So I got exposed to a lot of the sort of polymeric drug delivery side of things, PLGA microparticles and such. And I was interested in that, but I didn't really know what facet of biomedical engineering I wanted to pursue. And it was really through Edith's mentoring that she said, I should go to graduate school and get a PhD. Nobody really in my family had a PhD, and I didn't really know what that meant. And certainly in the community that I'd grown up in, it was either you could be a medical doctor or a business person, but really there was nothing else that you would want to be. But, I sort of was armed with this knowledge that, if I could get through graduate school and sort of go on that path to academia, I could, again, be able to contribute to this community in terms of both science and inclusion. So I ended up going to graduate school and went to UC Berkeley and UCSF. And again, this really was, I think, facilitated by the research that I did as an undergraduate. I did not have perfect grades, and I know, I sort of look at admissions people, the applications that come to me now, I go, wow, everybody seems to be these amazing people who do well in everything. But I don't think that necessarily needs to be the case in order to move forward in science. And so, I like to tell people that just because you haven't, had this perfect undergraduate GPA, should not limit your enthusiasm to move forward. And it was, again, really the recommendations that I got from the research side that I think allowed me to go to a graduate school that, ended up being a really great place for me to develop as a scientist. One of the things, again, that sort of also attracted me to UC Berkeley and UCSF was the fact that it was a very open-ended program. They sort of encouraged exploration, and it was at Berkeley, which, again, I was excited about being in an environment where I could pursue sort of an interest on the activism front. And so little did I realize that, you have less time in graduate school, I guess, but I ended up still being involved very much, in this case, more in Asian American issues. I served on the board of Asian American Women's Foundation, did a lot of law advocacy for Asian American communities in San Francisco, and then I also taught middle school Science Fridays throughout my graduate career to inner city public schools because I felt like that made me a better scientist. And I think in the end I do feel like the experiences I gained at all of those levels, talking to different communities, talking to different constituents, and talking to different students at every level has allowed me to think about science in a way that's accessible. One of the things that when I got to Berkeley, again, was sort of a challenge that became an opportunity, is that I ended up joining a lab that actually had no prior history in biomedical engineering. I was a student, at Berkeley, sort of doing rotations, looking at labs, and there was a lab run by Mauro Ferrari, who is now actually at Methodist Hospital in Houston, but at that time he was sort of an untenured professor at Berkeley, and he was working in the area of MEMS. So these are microelectromechanical systems, things that you use for accelerometers, in sensors, and at that point, so this was 1994 or so, people hadn't sort of thought about using these microstructures for biology. And he sort of came to me, actually knowing that I had had some experience in drug delivery, and wondered whether I would be interested in trying to pursue a project at the interface of MEMS and therapeutic delivery. And I have a siren in the background, so I'll let that pass. I actually was very reluctant in terms of joining his lab. My academic advisors, both at Berkeley and UCSF, were like, you're never going to graduate if you join this lab. It's like a crazy idea. Who thought of putting, no one's going to put silicon into the body. Why would you ever think about putting, interfacing cells with sensors? But the vision that my PI had was very exciting to me. And sort of that notion of taking two different areas and trying to put them together was very much something that I was motivated to do. And so I ended up staying in his lab. And because he wasn't a biomedical engineering lab, I actually had to sort of set up the cell culture facilities. He was actually his lab was in the civil engineering department, which meant that part of his lab was looking at the mechanics of concrete and looking at sort of sensors and devices to look at earthquake detection and other sort of things that had nothing to do with biomedical engineering. And so right next to where they were pounding the concrete, I set up a cell culture hood and started to work on ways that we could deliver cells and sort of create cell-based microstructures. And that turned out to be my PhD project. So the challenge was sort of bringing micro nanotechnology together with cell biology. And now it's something we sort of, I think, take for granted. Most people have done things, sort of know what microfluidics is and knows, how to micropattern and microstructure materials. We do a lot of work nowadays in encapsulating cells or delivering cell-based scaffolds. But at that time, again, trying to interface something that was fabricated, micro-machined with living cells was sort of this whole untapped area. And the skills that I got during my PhD, I think, allowed me to realize that if you don't take risks in sort of bringing together different areas, you're never going to get sort of the rewards in terms of moving into being able to open up new fields. So that was my graduate work. I ended up finishing that, and really at that time it was sort of the birth of what we called biomedical nanotechnology. And this was sort of a field, again, that just was starting to mature, not even mature, just starting to be born. And I was lucky enough to really sort of be one of the first people in that area, largely by accident, but also because my mentor began to really sort of take these ideas and push them forward and began to train a whole set of bioengineers who could do so. So when I finished, I really had sort of this interest in how do you begin to not only use nanotechnology in biology for diagnostics, things like genomics and gene sequencing, but from my perspective, because I had this interest in drug delivery, could we use nanotechnology in the biologic context for tissue engineering, tissue regeneration, and then cellular and drug delivery. And that, I think, has sort of been the pervasive theme of my research group through the last 18 years or so, where I'm really interested in how the structure at materials at the micro nanoscale can really influence the cellular environment, and then how we can use that therapeutically. So the question, of course, was when I finished up my PhD, what should I do? I, again, was interested in all of these different things. I wanted to do research, and I was excited by this new field that was emerging. I also love to teach at all levels, high school, middle school, college, and then wanted to continue the community outreach and engagement that I had started. And I said, I should just apply to everything. I ended up applying to postdocs and industry positions and faculty positions all at once. And it turned out that actually at that time there weren't a lot of postdocs in the biomedical engineering area. And in fact, the interviews that I got were mainly faculty positions. So it was sort of a very interesting time because biomedical engineering was just starting to take off, and a lot of departments were creating or being created, and so they wanted to hire faculty. And I was in this area that was starting to grow, so the timing was really, I think, the right time to start to launch my academic career. But I think the more important sort of piece of advice that I got, particularly from my PI, was that I could use the academic environment and sort of a career as a professor as a platform to really pursue all of my interests. That I could pursue the science and the engineering, but I'd also have an opportunity to make an impact in those other areas that I was interested in. And that really, I think that really sort of struck a chord with me, because I thought about, what other environment would I be able to do all of these different things? And then he also said, what, if it doesn't work out, it's such, it's not going to be the end of the world, because you have all of these different interests. Use this as an opportunity to, explore what you really want to do. And I think putting it in that perspective was really helpful, because it didn't make it seem that if I went the academic path and I didn't get tenure, that would be the end of the world. So I ended up actually taking a position right after I finished my PhD. So I got my degree in June, and then I started as an assistant professor in August. And I actually took a position at the University of Illinois Chicago. And this, again, was sort of an interesting position because, first of all, a lot of my, again, mentors at Berkeley were sort of wondering why I wanted to go here. The reactions were sort of interesting because they kept saying, well, go, do some more research where you're at, wait a little bit more time, you can get a position at sort of a premier, quote-unquote, premier institution. I was pretty adamant to sort of saying, well, I think this position is perfect because it was in an institution that was in an urban area. It educated a lot of different diverse communities, and I was going to have the opportunity to sort of build a bioengineering program. And so I ended up taking this position, even despite sort of some of the advice from a lot of my thesis committee members. Again, I think because my passion was always to do both the research but also to make sure that I could reach students in a meaningful way. So when I was at UIC, I learned a lot. Again, I went from being a graduate student to suddenly being a professor. And I was the second hire after the chair. So I literally our faculty meetings were 2, and then there were 3 people in our faculty meetings, and then there were 4. And so, every year we would sort of add, every few months we would add one more person. But what I realized, and I had the sort of luxury of the fact that it was just me, I didn't have a family at that point, is that I could spend a lot of time both on my research, but also I had the opportunity to build a program. I ended up defining the curriculum, defining a lot of the directions for the biomedical engineering department at UIC, and wrote a lot of institutional grants alongside with sort of trying to build up my own research. So I wouldn't advise that for anyone anymore, but at that point it was really great because I was sort of being mentored one-on-one by a senior faculty member who really took me under their wings. This was Richard Megan at UIC, and showed me how to not only build a lab but also build a department. One of the things that I realized very quickly, and it's something that I've carried on throughout my career and all the way to UCSF, is to really link with the faculty around me, and particularly with the medical school. This was important because I could make all of the greatest sort of materials I wanted, but if there was no biologic or clinical relevance, then ultimately it would be sort of creating technology for its own sake rather than really making an impact. And so those early experiences at UIC with its large medical school right next to me really helped me to both think about the problems I wanted to work on, but also helped me get sort of my first NIH grant where I, co-PI'd with a biologic faculty in the cardiac space. And, that helped me really put in perspective how important it is for engineers and clinicians to work together. And I also was able to build a really diverse lab group. So I had a lot of first-generation college students, non-traditional students, students who didn't necessarily have engineering as a background, but were very determined, amazing students. And of my sort of first group of students that I had at UIC, 5 of 6 of them ended up going on to academic careers, which is probably more than I ever had in sort of a single group after that. So again, I think again, this experience really reinforced my interest in thinking about how there's many paths to get to where you want to go, and how important different perspectives are. There were some challenges, though, and I think one of the challenges that sort of hit me early on is I was in this wonderful department. I had a great department chair, but I was also in a college of engineering where if you looked at the whole engineering faculty, there were only about 2 women out of over 100 faculty. And I actually ended up being in a few situations, in particular where some of my colleagues in other departments wouldn't let me and our lab group access some key facilities there. I actually was being shut out from one of the microfabrication facilities that was key to my research. And this, I didn't understand what was happening, and my chair actually had to intervene, and it got escalated to the provost level in order to make this facility something that my group could have access to. And it was really, I guess, eye-opening because I didn't think that things like that would happen in academia for some reason. I sort of thought everybody, was just, things were open to everybody, that no one should stand in your way for research. But it turned out that was sort of one instance of sort of access to resources being blocked. In this case, really because of, I think it was, as I later learned, sort of age and gender. And one of the questions that really raised was, is this the place that I wanted to build my research group forward? And in fact, my chair, who was, again, wanted me to stay to build a department, actually also encouraged me to think about other opportunities because he felt that the environment wasn't a great place for me to build my career. And so it was sort of this very interesting time for me where I loved where I was, but I also felt like if I wanted to be successful in biomedical engineering, maybe I needed to go to some place that would help my research program grow. So that was about 3 years at UIC, and I ended up then talking to some folks who said that BU was trying to build up their program in micro and nanotechnology, particularly within their very large biomedical engineering program. And it turned out I was sort of a really perfect research fit for what they were looking for. And so 3 years after starting as an assistant professor, I ended up moving to BU. And I wasn't tenured, but I had asked as I was moving whether they would consider me for tenure. And I actually would never have asked that if it wasn't for my husband, who I just married the year earlier, who said, what's the harm in asking? If the worst they can do is say no. And it turned out that they ended up sort of going out for letters and allowing me to come in tenured to BU. So again, I was, I think, lucky in terms of the timing and the things that I was doing to be able to come to Boston, be able to really grow my research program. And I think this is sort of the formative years of where I began to develop as a biomedical engineer. It was a large department, had a lot of great resources. I got to build networks with all of the faculty across Boston, all the institutions, and I got a lot of mentorship and colleagues in terms of my science. And it was at this time I also had my first child, so I started to think about where I wanted to be long term. And so about 4 years later, I got a call from a colleague back at UCSF, actually not a colleague, but it was my former academic advisor who I had kept in touch with, and she said that they were going to start a biomedical engineering department at UCSF, and would I be interested in coming back to help get that off the ground. And I had to think hard because UCSF is not a school of engineering. It is a health science campus. It has amazing research, amazing clinical and basic science, but I would be one of the few bioengineers in that environment. But it was also California, and I could come back to where most of my family was. I had my first child. I was actually pregnant with my second child when I was interviewing for UCSF. And I, at some point, my husband actually also, who I met in Chicago, was from California. We thought this is the time to move back to California. And I was also at a point that I had a lot of interest that I wanted to see translate from the lab. And so I thought maybe being in this clinical environment, health science environment, also in sort of the heart of San Francisco and Silicon Valley would allow me to sort of push the translation of my work further. And it also gave me this great platform to be a leader. And what I had realized over the many years is that I love to start new things. And so this was an opportunity to start not only a department, but also multiple new programs with Berkeley, and also be able to launch, hopefully, some of our technologies out of the lab. The other thing that I think really helped me sort of decide that UCSF was the right place was, again, its public mission. And as part of what they sort of sold to me was the fact that UCSF was really a place that is embedded within the community, within San Francisco, and serves this huge advocacy role in terms of science for both the local community and the national level. And so I again, became very involved and have had the privilege to think about how to bring biomedical engineering not only to those who are already educated in the sciences, but to all kinds of populations, whether that's children's health or advocacy in DC, whether that's STEM in public schools. I sort of was able to go full circle, and that is probably the reason why I'm still here many years later. Actually, now I've been at UCSF for about 12 years, and there's sort of this constant innovation that's allowed my science to go in many, many different directions. And I've been able, hopefully successfully, at least I try to sort of create a culture in the lab that values diversity. And when I say diversity, it's really sort of diverse perspectives, not a certain type of diversity. I have a very multidisciplinary group. So I have bioengineers, but because I'm also at a place that has a lot of other health science disciplines, we have people from pharmacy, nursing, dentistry. We have graduate students from biophysics and chemistry and all of the other life sciences, but also MDs and residents. And then I make it a point to really try to get students that are from sort of non-traditional backgrounds. So I have right now interns from Berkeley City College, one of which is a visual science major who really wanted to shift his career to the sciences. Another woman who did her undergraduate work in sort of the sociology of medicine, who, again, is interested in research and the intersection between populations and research. And I think it really has helped me sort of put sort of what we're doing scientifically in the context of a larger community. So right now, we're really a lab that's interested in basic science all the way to translation. And we work across a lot of different domains, everything from microparticles and sort of injectable formulations to more medical device applications. So we've developed stent technology that is now gone out of the lab, is being commercialized. We've worked with companies on transdermal patch technology, that is also being developed in a phase 1 clinical trial. And ultimately, the question that we're really interested in is how can we modulate therapeutic delivery by tuning the structure of our materials. And I think we've been able to sort of form a niche scientifically at UCSF that makes it really easy to collaborate with the basic science world that's here, but also the clinical world. And we've been very lucky to have colleagues across almost all the different clinical disciplines: ophthalmology, dermatology, surgery, radiology, you name it. And those interactions have been really fruitful for us because we're really interested in how to create a productive, collaborative environment. So I'm going to try to end here. There are still challenges, and I think these challenges are things that we all are aware of in the recent news. But, being a woman, being Asian American, particularly now at the department chair level, has been interesting. I've gotten comments ranging from, you have 3 kids, you're never going to succeed in the field, to you have 3 kids, you're never going to have enough time to do this, so we're going to not offer you these opportunities. I have to sort of struggle with my own internal demands of how to balance all of this, making the lab a priority and the research a priority, but above all, my family a priority. And I think where that really comes to bear is sort of the travel and the networking that's required to be successful in science. And I think I particularly appreciate that at the stage that I'm in when I see, many of my colleagues being able to go to every single conference out there. And I am very strict about, I leave at a certain time every day. I, limit my travel to 1 conference a month at the most, and I make it sort of a rule within me to ask whether this is going to be important for my career or important for my leadership role before I accept an invitation. That being said, I think my life in academia has been amazingly rewarding. And I wouldn't trade it for any other thing. I think, as many of us know, and just being in the sciences, it's never boring. It's always intellectually stimulating. I get to sort of determine what I want to spend time on, to at least the extent to which I can support my research. But also, I can do initiatives like, go to the schools and develop outreach programs, and I can think about other things that may not directly be related to my research. But above all, it's about training the next generation and impacting the community. And, that's what I've always loved to do. So just in terms of lessons learned, I think one of the things I would say is, don't be afraid to take risks, especially early in your career. There are going to be times where the opportunity is there and try to take advantage of it. Definitely find good mentors and collaborators. You're going to hear this over and over again. I can't, overstate how important this is. And then not just find them, but keep in touch with them. The community is actually very small. And, it hadn't have been for the advisor that I kept in touch with at UCSF and sort of a mentor that I had at Brown that I still keep in touch with, many opportunities would not have been there for me when I was looking for them. And the other thing is that even if you leave an institution, I think it's really important to maintain positive relationships. And so even if I've transitioned from one place to the other, I've tried to make it a point to do it in a way that preserves the relationship and preserves the integrity of what we, or sort of the promises that we made, and live up to our end of the deal. And so, my chair at UIC and my former chair at BU, these are some of my most important mentors still. And finally, create a diverse team that's open to new ideas and be able to support those new ideas. And hopefully that will lead to a lot of fun and a successful professional career. So thank you so much. I'm happy to answer questions. This is my lab at UCSF right now, and thank you for all being there.
All right, thank you, Dr. Desai. We'd now like to take some time to answer your questions. You may submit your questions online using the chat feature on your screen, and we will get to as many as we can. So I guess I will go ahead and get started with one question, Dr. Desai. You mentioned that you had experiences along the way where people in higher positions of leadership doubted you. And you said that it's important to find people in those leadership positions that will support you and set you on the right track. So what did you find was the best way to find those supportive leaders?
Yeah, it's not always easy. I think it's a combination of looking at those people who you would sort of inspire you, as well as in some ways role models or people that you would love to emulate in some ways, and not to rely on one person as sort of serving all of the roles in mentoring. So there are different people I go to for science mentoring than I do for career mentoring, and different people I talk to for leadership, and it's sort of finding the right person to fulfill that role for you. And to be honest, I'm right now I haven't found necessarily a mentor right at UCSF that is like the person I go to, and I've actually gone to a lot of mentors outside of the institution. So I don't think they necessarily have to be local, but they have to be people who know what your strengths and weaknesses are and can help you navigate that.
Great, thanks. So we have another question from one of the members in the audience. So how did you decide to pursue academic research rather than a position with more direct activism within higher education?
Yeah, I think what sort of motivated me is that when I was doing a lot of the work with sort of looking at faculty and looking at issues of diversity in faculty, it always comes back to that pipeline and trying to get enough role models there in the first place in order to then influence the next generation. And so in the back of my mind, I think what I always felt is that if the further I could go sort of as an academic career and establish the credibility of being a legitimate scientist and engineer, the more influence I could wield in terms of changing some of the institutional practices. And I think, it happens, but it's very slow. But I still think that the fact now that I can go to the leadership here, both with the scientific credentials, but then also understanding these other issues, gives me a little bit of a leg up in terms of trying to make some change. So I've really used the academic route as a vehicle for both furthering science, but also, being able to create some institutional change.
Okay, great. And we have, I guess, one last question here. So you've made many risky moves in your career. How did you sit with the discomfort that you might fail? I'm not a risk taker by nature, to be honest. I really am not. Many of my decisions were maybe ended up being risky, but they were also motivated by the people who I would get to work with, or the people who would surround me, and I was encouraged by family and friends to make those moves. And sort of had that support structure around me. So, I knew that if I went to UIC and it didn't work out,
I had people who said, hey, you could come back and do a postdoc with me, right? Or you could go and work on these other problems. So it's only a snapshot of your life. It's not, if you think about the academic career as being, 30, 40 years long, having an instance and having 3 years and it doesn't work out is not going to be the end of the world, as long as you're learning new skills along the way. So, I would say the support of family and friends has been instrumental. I also, my spouse has been sort of amazing through this, because he isn't, he has a very demanding career as much, more than me in some ways, but he's been able to sort of move to these different locations as long as they're a big city. And so that has allowed me to take these opportunities, and that's not always the case. So, some of it is also just fortuitous in how that worked out.
Okay, great. And it looks like we have a couple more questions that came in, so we'll just take these last two. They're quite related. So how do you choose which research directions to pursue, and would you have any advice for someone attempting to move to a new area?
Yeah, so I think 2 points here. So I think, first of all, as a postdoc, it's important to see if you can carve out sort of a part of your research experience that can be somewhat independent, or that you could sort of take with you, and that's a tricky line. Even as with my PI, as I was finishing graduate school, I sort of, we had the conversation, hey, this stuff that I had done, I could take that with me, and that he would not be pursuing that, and that he was going to go in sort of the direction of cancer, but I could do diabetes and sort of all of these other things. But if there's an opportunity to be able to carve out some area which is related but not directly the same as what you're doing as a postdoc, I think that's very important. The other thing is again, a lot of our research idea comes from collaborations. So by sort of talking about what we do, more and more ideas get generated from people who are in all of these different fields. And so what we had maybe thought of was going to be applied to some disease or some organ or tissue, we end up doing a completely different application or scientific question based on the expertise and the interest of those around us. So, an example of that is we were developing some drug delivery technology for implants and sort of slow release of proteins. And when I first got to UCSF, I had given a presentation on that, and there were some ophthalmologists in the crowd, and they said, well, can you, we've been looking for something that can be adapted to sort of be able to deliver drugs into the eye. And so we started talking and ended up sort of developing a whole new research direction based on, adapting our technology for ocular delivery that is, sort of resulted in an R01 and a patent and a startup company and all of this really by sort of a conversation that happened because we presented to a group of clinicians. So oftentimes it's sort of thinking about sharing what you're doing to diverse audiences that can help you set some different research directions.
All right, great. And we have the last question. Are you aware of any efforts that are being taken by academic institutions to increase the diversity of the applicant pool for undergraduates or graduate students?
I think there's a lot. I think there's a lot of interest. Whether it's actually translating, I think, is the big question. I know for a fact, we here have made a really concerted effort to look at ways in which we're evaluating applications particularly for graduate school for diverse populations. In fact, there was even emails this morning that were thinking about, whether we need to have the GRE as a metric, or, are there other ways? We often use that as a gateway, but that actually is not necessarily correlative to some of the things that we see, certainly. So we are very much sort of taking or flagging applications that bring in either diverse backgrounds or non-traditional pathways, and having them actually have somebody who sort of a separate committee that reads those, and we pay extra attention to those applications. But it's a process that's going to take time. I know NIH is very interested in diversifying the workforce, so for any programs that have NIH training grants, they're requiring us to really put in substantial effort to justify how we're picking applicants and how we're creating a diverse environment.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Desai. And thanks to everyone for your questions. That's about all the time we have for today. So this concludes our webinar, and we thank you for joining us. Please stay online and take a few minutes to complete the brief webinar evaluation before you go. We would greatly appreciate your feedback. And we would also like to remind you that the webinar is being recorded for your convenience. The slides and archived audio recording will be available on the BMES e-learning page. You will be notified by email when the archived materials have been posted. We hope you'll join us again for other BMES events. To learn more about upcoming BMES activities and events, please visit www.bmes.org. Thank you.